All right, welcome to the Franchise Freedom Podcast. I'm your host, Giuseppe Grammatico, your franchise guide, and today we have a very special guest. We have Jake Anderson. Jake is the founder at Pod Commander and host of the Introspective Podcast. Jake is an award-winning entrepreneur with more than 10 years experience in building startups. Today, Jake's mission focuses on helping entrepreneur podcasters develop in-house podcast management systems using his tripod method, which systematizes the three pillars of podcast management, which is booking, production, and marketing. Jake is also the host of the Introspective Podcast, a top 100 podcast on Apple that speaks on topics of lifestyle design, business strategy, and mindful entrepreneurship. Jake, wanted to welcome you to the show.
Thank you. I really appreciate you having me on the show. It's great to be here and just sharing my message and getting connected with your audience.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. And for everyone listening in, I was on Jake's show, I think it was last month, that we had a really good time, and I'm sure we could have spent 2 hours on the show, but just to keep it to that 30-minute mark, let us fill the audience in just a little bit on your background. How did you get into what you're doing today?
Yeah, so I got started in entrepreneurship is really where my core passion is. And I started that journey back when I was 18 years old. And I'll make a long story short here, because this is certainly a long story when it comes to the first company. I started my first company in the special events industry in 2012. Technically, I got into it in 2008, but it was 2012 when I actually started the first real successful business that grew, and I was able to scale it. And I sold that company last December, which was by the grace of God, because it was a business in the special events industry, and trying to sell that type of company during the middle of a pandemic is pretty challenging, but we were able to make it work. And so I've exited that business. But there's a couple things, and I got into podcasting, really early 2019. And technically even in 2018 to some degree, but it was 2019 when I started really getting into it. And I love connecting with people. Relationships are really a big part of who I am and how I like to build my business. And podcasting felt very aligned in that regard. I wasn't really thinking about taking on podcasting at that time as a business venture per se. I just enjoyed it, and I wanted to kind of embellish in it more and learn the trade and learn the different strategies and ways to grow your podcast. So fast forward to today and kind of how it's come about to where I'm at today. What led me to the decision to start Pod Commander and get on this mission to helping entrepreneur podcasters came from a couple places. And the first place it came from was looking at myself. Like, what are my skills? What can I bring to the table? I knew I was selling this business. I need to flip the new chapter. What's the next thing for Jake? And there were a couple things that I was very successful with in my first company. And the first one was building systems and teams, basically. With that first company, I was able to systemize it. I staffed it. We had about a team of 18. And I wasn't part of the operations. I didn't do any of the production work, none of the sales work, pretty much none of the admin work either. It was very much so a visionary level that I was at, which was, I think a lot of entrepreneurs aspire to get to that place of like, I just want to be at the visionary level and be that person, and then have the operations managed by a team. So I was able to accomplish that because of my ability to create solid systems and also manage a team through those systems. So that was the first skill set. The second skill set was in relationship building. So in my first company, I practically built the whole entire business on relationships. I would go to different venues and places and cultivate those relationships. And through that, the business was able to, for the first 3 years, it doubled in size. So it had exponential growth, all on the power of relationships and building strategic partnerships in the industry and finding those points of complementary synergy between my business and somebody else's business, and really exploring that. So if you think of podcasting, where can you fit that into podcasting, which was this newly found passion of mine? It was like, okay, well, I can certainly bring the systems piece into play. And podcasting, as you know, Giuseppe, is like such a powerful relationship building tool, right? You get on a call with somebody for an hour and have a conversation on something that's pretty deep. You go pretty deep with that person, that conversation. By the end of it, you feel like you really have a connection there with them.
Right.
And you can cultivate that into wherever it can go. It could be a strategic partner. Maybe they can become a client for you. Maybe they can become a referral source, but they're in your network at that point. So what I've decided to do is, again, take those two skills and apply it to podcasting and fill something that I felt like was missing in the market, which was, how do you manage your podcast if you want to bring it in-house? Because really the only other the options people have right now if they get into podcasting is either to use an agency who pretty much just does it all for you, or you try to figure it out yourself. You're kind of piecemealing it. You're bringing in some freelancers, and it could be a bit of fiasco in the beginning, especially as you're learning. So I'm bringing in kind of like the middle ground here, almost a hybrid model where, the entrepreneur podcaster can get the system, the SOPs, and all the tools to kind of pull into what they're doing with their podcast to be able to turn it into a true business asset. And again, it all came from the passion I had for podcasting and combining that with the proficiency that I had in business, which was with the systems, teams, and relationship building.
Right. Yeah, no, you've accomplished quite a bit. And we both have podcasts. So I'm a big fan of it. I'm about just over a year in, and it's been great, especially, with the pandemic. It's been a way to network, a way to talk with people across the entire world. We've had podcast episodes of people from Thailand and Mexico to Italy. I mean, literally Spain. We had one. So Canada. So it's been, I call it the international podcast, which is really nice. It's just got to balance those time zones, as I jokingly say. That's a job in and of itself.
No
but it's funny because when I do talk to people, and one of the reasons I wanted to invite you on the show is I get a lot of questions on podcasts, and I'm not an expert in any way. I have used full service agencies in the past. I'm kind of doing a hybrid approach right now on my own, and it's working out okay. It could definitely be better, but people don't realize what a podcast is, and I think they look at it as, well, there's tons of podcasts. How am I going to compete, or how am I going to make money? And I think you have to just kind of figure out why you want the podcast. So prior to the show, I wish we hit the record button a little sooner, because we had some really good stuff we talked about. But we talked about, you pick your primary, your primary, way of marketing or networking. And I think podcasting kind of accomplishes quite a bit. It's a networking tool. But it's also great content, right? It's recorded, quotes are taken out. A lot of the parts of the show can be repurposed. So, I think really your entire marketing strategy can be built around podcasts, kind of creating that flywheel where, you have the podcast, it creates the content, it creates the blog. I personally have, through another agency, recorded 2 podcasts. They were solo podcasts, just me, and I wrote an entire book. So when we talk about repurposing, an entire book was written, blog posts, social media, all done from 1-hour shows that I typically record on a weekly basis, let alone the people that we're meeting in the process, and, the audiences that we're getting, we're being able to speak with. So I think, and I always jokingly say, I should say, a face for podcasting, but now we're on video, so that doesn't apply anymore. But I think there's so much value. So, I guess I said quite a bit, and to kind of follow on what you said, but who is the right fit for a podcast? Who should consider it? What are kind of the secret sauce in having a successful podcast?
I think it starts with, let's just remove the word podcast from the equation for the amount. Let's just forget that this is a podcast. And what we're doing is that we're creating and curating thoughts. Mm-hmm. We're recording and documenting thoughts that are created. Right now we're having an interview, and we're having an exchange of thoughts based around a central topic, that being podcasting. So from there, what do you do with that? Well, you can distribute that in different vehicles. The podcast is a vehicle where you can distribute it. It's recorded, it's distributed to podcast. It could be distributed to YouTube, to your blog, to social media. Heck, you can even write a book out of that. That's pretty amazing that you were able to take recordings, the documentation of those thoughts that you've recorded, and turn that into an actual book. So I think the first thing that people need to kind of do to shift away from this, and this will get to the answering your question, like, who's this for? But the first thing you need to do, if you're on that fence of like, I don't know if this is for me or not, the first thing you need to do is just forget about the fact that this is a podcast and just think about this as you're documenting your thoughts or something you create yourself. That can be done through solos, and I'll call it curating, because that could be finding other people to bring on as a guest to curate, as a way to kind of curate the thoughts that can also help supplement and amplify that message to your audience through that curation process. Okay, so that's the first thing. We gotta kind of think about it like that.
Like that.
So the other thing is, when it comes to understanding if this is a right fit for you, I think it comes down to whatever your strategic plan is for your business and what type of business you want to run. So if you're somebody who wants to really start showing up online, you want to get into content marketing, you've got a message, you want to start building an audience, and that is a big part of your strategy, then, and you've got some kind of an outcome you desire from that, then podcasting is something to heavily consider. Now, there's other things. You could just do a YouTube channel. You could just do a blog. Right. If you're somebody who likes to have conversation and you like to speak, then podcasting is going to be a good fit for you. And I'm pretty certain that podcasting is the most is the most versatile piece of content you can create, because you can do it in video. You can't really turn a YouTube video into a podcast, but you can turn a podcast into a YouTube video, because your podcast can be recorded, and the way it's structured makes it easier, especially if you ask certain intentional questions that leads to good YouTube videos.
Right.
So it's highly repurposable. I mean, you can do so much with it. Plus, it gives you the ability to get your message in front of new audiences. Like right now, I'm getting my message in front of your audience by coming onto your show, just like your message got in front of my audience when you came onto my show. So if that's the way, if you have a desire to reach, to get, you have a message, you have in your strategic plan to get that message out to a specific audience online, then you should consider podcasting as part of your strategy, knowing that this is a way to really streamline your content. You're able to, I think, become more omnipresent too, because it can be distributed in such a way. So you have that aspect of it. And then there's also the relationship building aspect of it. So you're thinking like, okay, I'm online and I'm trying to build new relationships. So how can I do that? And sometimes it's, people are, if I didn't have a podcast and I just reached out to somebody and said, hey, I'd love to network with you and what have you, you might get a little bit more resistance. It might be a little bit more challenging to get that person to say, yeah, let's meet up for some coffee, or let's meet up for whatever talk. It's like, here's another one of those things where,
right.
Another networking event. I remember back when I was doing networking events, it was, certain people, it's like, yeah, if you had a good, deep conversation with them, you felt like you got to know each other. Yes, let's continue this. Let's actually set up a time to chat. But with the podcast, you can, number one, you can actually get higher profile people to have those conversations with. Like if you have a podcast, I mean, there's certain guests that I'm looking to bring on my show that are in their own right, a larger than life person, from the public perception. Like right. I had Dr. Bill Dorfman, who's the celebrity in South Hollywood. He's been interviewed by Oprah and Larry King, and he came on to have an interview with me. Right. So if I didn't have a podcast, that conversation would have never been possible. So if you think about it as a networking tool, this is something I want to use as a networking tool to build my business.
Right.
It's second to none. I don't know anything else that's more powerful for building your network than podcasting, because number one, when you bring somebody on your show, you give it that space to take a deep dive into what that person's about. You have that exchange of energy and it's conversational. So with that being the case, you're going to leave that interview knowing that person on a much deeper level, and they know you have that energy exchange. it's at that point in time, it's like now you make the decision, do you cultivate that relationship into something bigger than what it was from the podcast or not? Obviously you should cultivate it. It should be something if it makes sense for you. So those are really the two things that I would say, if you're thinking about podcasting, is this the right decision for me? You need to go back to your strategy. And, if you're running a food truck on the side of the street and that's your business and you're just trying to pick up that local foot traffic, podcast might not be for you, might not do much for your business. I don't know, maybe. I can't really see that model working so much, but if you're really into, building client relationships and strategic partners in your business, maybe you're an online coach or you've got some consulting firm, or maybe even you're a service provider in some ways, you can create a podcast. Like you've got Franchise Freedom, that's very congruent with what you do. And that ends up becoming an asset for you, for your content and also for your network.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And to your point, I've even seen people without businesses, they're an employee at a company and they have a pretty interesting strategy. I've heard a few where they're almost, interviewing other higher management, other companies. So they're using it, maybe they don't get a lot of downloads, but to your point, they're using it for networking and content. And man, will they remember you? You're putting that person on a pedestal, interviewing them. That's going to stand out better than any LinkedIn profile or resume that they've ever seen. So there's some huge benefits. And I just had a show earlier this morning with someone who is in career transition. He's a career coach, and we just talked about networking never ends. Just because you landed your job or started your first business or just sold the business, networking, you're always out there meeting people. And again, given the pandemic, it's been difficult to meet in person. So, why not a podcast and have fun? I get to talk, I get to meet new people and create some really good content and marketing out of it. So, I think that the biggest surprise to me was writing that book, and it was surprisingly easy. Obviously, there's some editing and there's a structure and outline that you want to put together, but it was fun. I couldn't see myself sitting down to actually write a book ever. I don't think I had the patience or the focus for that. So kind of forced me to put together some really good structured content and convert it into a book. So really, really good stuff there. And I think I'm going to share this. I get the question of podcasting. What is a podcast? And I think you nailed it. Remove the word podcast, because technically we could just be recording a video or webinar right now and not post it to the podcast sites like Apple and iTunes, Google Podcasts and things like that. And now it's just a video. Now it's just a webinar, right? You start adding the audio, and now it's a podcast. So I think there's some sometimes negative connotations, on the word podcast, and I think people are looking at it differently. It's an all-inclusive kind of thing. We covered quite a bit. What else am I missing on podcasts? Because I'm a year into it. I'm learning daily. I didn't realize, maybe we could talk about repurposing. I didn't realize how much you can actually repurpose the show's content, for your marketing, for your blog posts and things like that. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. I've been very intentional about testing content, and my mentor and coach, George Bryant, he's got a slogan. It's called "Relationships Beat Algorithms," and he's really big into the power of relationships and how you can cultivate that online in a way that helps grow your business, and how that should be the main focus. And some of the things that I have been working on testing and I've been finding some results is like finding ways to kind of bring your podcast full circle back into your social media as a conversational piece.
Right.
And I know that when it comes to repurposing, and again, I'm a type A, data driven. Like I have to have some KPI right. to understand if it's working or not. And when it comes to repurposing, you're taking that content, you're putting it on social media, and the way you can measure results of it is you can either look at the views. If it shows you the views, not all content will show you how many views, but a lot of it does. It'll show you how many views it gets. So that's the reach, how much reach did it get? And then you have engagement. And I look at engagement as the movement, like how much movement am I getting? So you can measure that as if somebody likes it, if so you put something out, somebody likes it. That's a form of movement. It's small movement, but it's still a form of movement. If somebody comments, that's another form of movement. But there's different levels of movement, even with the engagement in the comments. It could be that they say, love this, and they just kind of acknowledge it. Mm-hmm. But then there's also people actually having conversations within your threads. Have you ever seen posted something online and it actually creates conversations going on in your threads? That's pretty strong content if you can actually create that type of result from the post. So what I've been finding is I've started to develop more boundaries and rules and kind of how I repurpose based on that understanding, that philosophy of how I can really pull people into the conversation, through the podcast. And again, it's a testing thing. There's almost a science and an art to it. But one of the things that, and I'll just give you a couple examples, quote cards. We'll just take quote cards, right? Mm-hmm. Quote cards is a really simple thing to kind of repurpose off of a podcast. You can, something that I said or something your guest said is really powerful, right? And you're like, I want to capture that into a quote because it moved me. And if it moved me, then it certainly will move somebody in my audience. And that's my metric. I don't do quote cards for every show. I only do a quote card is if something was said that I felt like really kind of moved me personally. Mm-hmm. And the reason for that is I started, again, going through the analytics, and before I was doing quote cards, it was mainly a quote it was a good quote, nothing wrong with a good statement, but it wasn't, you ever just read those quotes, like, man, that is powerful. Mm-hmm. Like, that's the kind of, I look for that kind of level of quote for quote cards because I'm looking for movement. I'm looking for it to create some kind of movement in my content. So that's been some philosophy that I've kind of moved over to when it comes to repurposing. There's different thoughts around that. I think there's one school of thought where repurpose as much as you can, right? If you can take that one podcast and turn it into 60 pieces of content and just get it out there. That's one school of thought. And then there's the other school of thought that I'm more leaning into because I feel like I think it's more effective based on what I've seen in terms of results. Mm-hmm. Is I'm very strategic in how I repurpose now. For instance, for YouTube, one school of thought with just get it out there is it's more about quantity, like getting as much out there as you can. I'm more about less, but quality repurposed content. Right. Because when you repurpose it, you give it new purpose. So when it goes to this new channel, like YouTube, for instance, YouTube isn't really designed necessarily to have talking heads for 45 minutes. That's not why people typically go to YouTube. So with YouTube content, what I do is I actually I'll ask very specific questions that leads to answers that give frameworks. Mm-hmm. In my podcast. Like one of the questions, and actually this is a question I asked you on yours. I said, hey, Giuseppe, what are the benefits of hiring a broker for franchising your business? And guess what you're going to do? You're like, well, here's benefit 1, here's benefit 2, here's benefit 3, 4, 5. There's my YouTube video. It turns into the benefits, and it's actually picking up views. Mm-hmm. I used to put the whole episode on YouTube, and nobody would ever watch it. Right. And now I started doing this. Now I'm actually, even in the first week, it started to pick up views because the organic search is like, oh, people who are looking for hiring a business or a franchise broker and they're searching for that, this is going to show up in the search results because it's now more searchable content. And it's very specific. It's only 8 to 10 minutes roughly. So you're getting more traction there. So there's a lot that goes into it, and I'm more on the school of thought that I'm very strategic in how I do my repurposing. I'd rather be heard. I call it it's great to be seen, but I'd rather be heard. And if you're trying to take 60 pieces of content and repurpose it, I think that I think you can lead into a place of just creating a lot of noise, and that noise ends up, I think that can deter people more than attract people.
Right.
And that's, again, this is me just taking a position on repurposing, because there's a couple of schools of thought there. I'm personally more on, I'd rather be very strategic. I want to be heard. I want people to be moved by the content. And I want that movement to lead to something of a result, whether that be a new lead for myself or for whoever my guest is too. Like, I want my guest to win on my podcast. Mm-hmm. If I ever have a guest reach out to me and say, man, like somebody just reached out to me and like they heard me on your show, I'm like, that's going to make my day, because I feel like I'm doing my job as a podcaster too. Like, I want to help. It's got to be, there's got to be reciprocity there. So you can almost make a whole episode just out of repurposing content. I could really go pretty deep into this area.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because I'm learning about it. I get the questions and it's like, well, let's get an expert on the line. Let's get Jake to kind of talk about it. And, what are the benefits? But, here's the thing. There's always great options, right? You can pick up a book, maybe talking about you could do this or that, but ultimately, people, well, a couple things, right? People don't know how to do it, nor do they, or maybe they just don't have the time or feel like they have the time. They feel like, I've never edited, I myself had never edited a podcast audio, let alone video, added subtitles and all that other fun stuff. So this is all new to me. And it gets to the point where you almost, in many cases, talking to other people, you don't even start because you're just overwhelmed from the very beginning. So, talk to us a little bit. I know you have, maybe we're jumping the gun here, but I wanted to make sure to bring this up. There's a webinar which I will be listening in next Monday, talking about repurposing, how to produce a podcast. I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong, but if you can just share information on the webinar, where do people start, and are there options where either we had talked about 3 options: doing it yourself, hiring an agency, and then instead of done for you, done with you, because as much as I myself would love an agency to do everything for me, I may not be able to afford it. So if you could talk a little bit more about the webinar, the service that you provide, and anyone listening in, because I'm literally going to send this episode to anyone that asks me about a podcast, and how to set it up, how to go about it. So talk to us. I know I threw a lot at you, but if you could talk a little bit about the webinar and what you and the service you provide.
Yeah, let me kind of tell a very quick backstory that led to this decision to create what I've created that's going to be presented in this webinar. Yeah. So and I think this is really important too for anybody who's listening and are thinking about launching a podcast. I want that person to really hear this story. Or if you have launched a podcast and you're already in this stage, you'll resonate with this. So I've launched 2 podcasts. The second one I launched that I'm running now was last August. And one of the big challenges for me when I launched this podcast was I was overwhelmed with managing it, keeping it up, trying to find guests, booking the guests, getting them onboarded, lining up the interview, doing the interview, the post-production work, following up with the guest, making sure that they can, hey, here's the stuff to share it with your audience, and then distributing it to just a platform and then continuing on with that cycle. And it got to a point where, and I actually had hired an agency too. This is the crazy thing about it. I hired an agency, and
you did? Okay, I didn't know that.
And the agency, they did. I mean, their scope of work, they deliver. I don't have anything bad to say about them. They did a good job, but I was still overwhelmed, and I still felt like, because they weren't handling the whole process, just the production part, and I said, you know what? And not on the side, it was more than really I should be spending anyway. It was like $1,000 a month. It's like, I'm still trying to figure this thing out as far as the management side of it. So through that experience, I said, okay, I'm going to take that skill of building systems and put it to work here. So that's what I did. I started building my own system, and, I looked at it. That's why I call it Tripod, because it's the 3 phases of podcast management, where you have the booking process, then you have production, and then really, there's distribution and marketing as kind of that flywheel that I talk about. And those are the 3 phases. even deeper than that, there's also 3 phases to, even with the guest, as far as like, how you can cultivate those relationships into something more. And those 3 phases are you got the prospecting of the guest and finding like who would be a good fit, who would be aligned as a potential partner, client, what have you. And then you actually have the follow-ups with them. And then you have how you cultivate that relationship into something bigger. So through that, I was like, okay, this is a lot to keep up with. There's a lot of balls in the air, there's a lot of moving pieces. This is how I want to execute. So last fall, I started working on this system. I was using, different software tools, project management tool. I was building out all the templates, and that's another thing. A key to this really being streamlined is to create templates for what you're building. So I've got email templates, I've got graphic templates, video templates, podcast, things are pre-recorded, and it's all plug and play at this point. So you create your templates, everything's plug and play, and then you have the system there to kind of help you manage the production of the content, as well as the distribution of the content, as well as the follow-ups and the relationship management piece of it. So I, started building that system, and through the time since last fall, like any system, one of the things you have to do is test it.
Right.
Test it. You got to break it, fix it, optimize it. And I even had some beta people in that were kind of doing the same thing, finding where the vulnerabilities were. I actually moved my podcast to a daily show 7 days a week because I wanted to take it to an extreme to see like how this system can handle a 7-day-a-week podcast. And that really shows the weaknesses pretty quickly. Right. When you start, you're like, okay, this is definitely worse week, but I was able to keep up with it. And since then I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and scale. Now that I've done this and I did it for a couple months, it's like, I'm going to go ahead and scale this back down. And then as far as my production, now that I found the weaknesses, and remodel it. And so that's kind of where it left off. And now I'm at a point where, this is ready to get presented to the market. I want to take it to other podcasters because the problem that I'm fixing, going back to that story I told you, was I'm sitting here overwhelmed, even had an agency handling some of the production work. But I think one of the things too that kind of left me a little bit unfulfilled in that arrangement was I wanted to have a little bit more involvement in the creative process. Mm-hmm. Right. And what I mean by that was, okay, well, I want to repurpose this kind of way. I want to distribute it to a blog. I want to do this type of YouTube video. Well, a lot of agencies, they have some flexibility, but a lot of them kind of have their way of doing it. It's right. Like the package, This is what you get. Mm-hmm. And so you're kind of limited to that package. It's like, I don't want to be limited. This is my content, this, I want to distribute these thoughts that we're documenting how I see best fit. And if I were to find an agency to repurpose this at that level and work at that level, I mean, you and I have talked about this. I mean, the cost is like all over the board. I mean, it's definitely multiple 4 figures a month. It could be anywhere from 2,000. I've even heard 8,000 a month for managing. Actually, I've heard 8,000 a month, and it's not even repurposing the blog or YouTube. That's just podcasts. I've heard.
Yeah, that's a lot of money.
A lot of money, right? So for anybody, I mean, that could, that's a substantial investment. It's like, but I don't want that to stop me from being able to produce at this level. And the only way I can do this is through in-house. So what I'm intending to do, and what my mission is to help that entrepreneur podcaster be able to turn their podcast into a business asset using this system. So you've got the relationship building aspect. How can you systemize the relationship management? I mean, I've got templates and work I use ClickUp. That's the project manager. Eventually I want to turn this to its own app, but for right now I use the technology I have available. So I have ClickUp, and I have an actual, workflow for how you can cultivate and manage those relationships. And there's different triggers and things you can put in there. So you got the system, the SOPs, standard operating procedures. If anybody's not familiar with the acronym, and then also various templates. The only thing I don't really do and I connect people with. I don't do any creative work. As far as I'm not going to do any design for you. I'm not going to do your audio editing. I don't really get into the done for you service, but I've got people that I can always recommend. And I think that's good because sometimes people might have somebody on their team that already can do graphics and they already have a heavy hand into the brand and managing the brand of their business. So it's like you make the choice who you want to kind of build that. If you don't have a person, I can hook you up with somebody. If you do, then you can use them. The bottom line here is we got to figure out how to manage this so it's sustainable and you can get the most out of your podcast without it becoming this, multiple 4-figure management investment every month that you have to pay a company to do for you. So the overall outcome is putting the power back into the hands of the podcaster, giving them the creative freedom. You got to be somebody. Now, this isn't for everybody. Some people just don't want to touch it. Some people are, I don't even want to think about it. I just want to show up and record. And you can get that. I think you can get that benefit out of this, but you have to have an interest in having creative involvement and having involvement in the process. Right. If you don't have any interest in that, that's really not for you. If you're not interested in turning your podcast into, and actually, I'll even read from it just for a second. I'll pull it because I'm like working on the who's it for. It's like you're currently managing an active podcast or considering the idea of launching a podcast. This is that entrepreneur who aspires to turn their podcast into a core business asset. You have a desire to play a role in the management and creative oversight of your content, and you believe that relationships are the cornerstone to your business success. Like if you can answer yes to those four statements, this is a good option for you, right? Because it essentially covers the way this is managed, covers those 4 areas. Right. And so, the webinar, I'm doing a webinar on April 19th. It's at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So if you want to be part of it, what I'm going to do is pretty much just give a full presentation on it. It's definitely going to be more of I feel like it's almost as going to be much of a masterclass as it is just a general webinar. I'm going to be very tactical in my presentation. I want to really kind of pull back the curtain and show what I've built and show the process of how this works. And then from there, if somebody is interested in utilizing this type of system for their podcast management, I'll have some next steps there for anybody who aspires to or wishes to take that on for their own podcast.
Actually, if I could just interject, I just realized, I know that it's this coming Monday, but this show won't be produced until after. I just realized that. So I apologize for that. I just realized that as I'm looking at my calendar. So so anyone listening to this, if it's going to probably be 2 weeks out, so it may be end of April, beginning of May. Sure. So if they want access to that, and obviously, there may be another webinar in the works, but can they gather that information if they go to the website? Would that be the best place?
Yeah, absolutely. There's certainly going to be a replay, and as this continues to develop, I'm always going to be updating kind of those presentations. But the best place to start with anything I'm doing, whether it be my podcast or things I'm working on, is to just go to www.connectwithjake.com. And then that's kind of like my link tree that gives you, shows like the latest and greatest of what's going on. So even right now, I've got a link that just takes you to, it's a really simple form I just kind of put together just for people to be able to, opt in and get the reminders and everything leading up to the webinar. So by the time this launches, you'll be able to you can just go to connectwithjake.com. And then from there, the site that I'll have created that will I'm still polishing things up, how there's a whole evolution of it, but, right. But I'll eventually have kind of the landing page, and I'll put the full webinar there, and for people to be able to get access to it. So there will be access. Just go to connectwithjake.com and you'll have access to that as well as my podcast, and you'll be able to kind of see more into my world as far as how I'm producing. I'm a firm believer of being a product of your product. And so everything I talk about, these are all things that I use. I wouldn't use anything else. So if it's working for me, I know it can work for other people.
No, very, very well said. And I do follow you on Facebook, and I can definitely, agree there. I've seen that you've been testing some things. We even were testing some things as far as releasing episodes and when to share, and, with the algorithms, and this is all new stuff to me, but is it better to share instantly or wait a few days? So
Yeah.
to get the maximum number of eyes on the post. So there's a lot to it. There is quite a bit. I feel like I'm learning every single day, and I've learned quite a bit. And I as I mentioned, if anyone follows Jake online, you'll definitely see that as he's testing things. And this is what worked. I was able to get more downloads this way. So it's very transparent. But for the people that need the assistance or need the kind of motivation or help in starting this, I definitely encourage you to. Obviously, this will be released later, but go to connectwithjake.com. We'll put that in the show notes. Jake, anything else you wanted to leave everyone with? That person that has been on the fence thinking about podcasting.
I'll say one last thing. I know for some people, I think if you're new to publishing content, it can be a bit intimidating. The thought of getting on a camera or recording yourself, going through this process of content creation can be intimidating for a lot of people.
Yes.
And I'll say for me, when I first got started in podcasting, I was terrified. I'm actually an introvert by nature. I have a lot of introverted areas. My mom laughs because when I was in kindergarten, I wouldn't even speak to the teacher. I was so shy. And she's like, "You're doing what now?" I'm like, "Yeah." She's like, "Oh my gosh." And wants to call my kindergarten teacher and let her know what I'm doing because just blow her away. So if you're introverted and you're like, "Oh, this isn't for me. I'm too much of an introvert," just know that if you really want to do this, and if that's the thing that's holding you back, seriously, send me a DM. Like, go to connectwithjake.com. You'll find where to connect with me. Like, send me a DM. We'll talk, because I'm certainly somebody who had to break through a lot of that resistance. And really the key to kind of getting through that, there's a couple things, and I'll leave your audience with this, especially for those that are in that position of resistance, right, is to, first off, understand that, and I'll use this quote by Seneca, as a old Stoic, is we suffer more from imagination than we do reality. And I remember the first time I recorded, I'm in my own mind picturing that I'm like stepping on this massive stage and everybody's going to be watching me, especially because I was doing them live. And it's like, no, that's not really what happens. And a lot of that you think that's going to happen actually is just all in your head.
Right.
And you have to, I think finding, I was looking for containers and places that I could kind of step into to document and publish that gave me a little bit more sense of security to kind of get warmed up with it. So I would go into groups that were really open to people going live. And, it just, everybody, I felt like I had that environment around me that gave me the security to kind of put myself out there. Right. But as you start doing more, like, understand that, it's a documentation of your journey. I mean, there's podcast episodes on mine. If you go back to number 1 and you listen up to where I'm at now, you'll see transformation. And that's a beautiful thing. That's something you should celebrate. My biggest why as to why I do podcasting above everything else, business and everything, is that I've got 2 little boys that are 4 and 7. And I know that when they start moving into the real world, the adult years, Daddy's got a whole documentation of wisdom from other thought leaders like Giuseppe and people I've had on my show, solo episodes of me, because I have my moment of introspection every Sunday, and they can hear that they can see and listen to that documentation of wisdom all through that time. And that's a gift that I'll be able to give them, because they are able to get that entire track record. Imagine if your parents were able to give that to you as a gift. I mean, now we're in a day of time where we can do that for our children. Back when I was growing up, we didn't have that.
Right.
So I think I go pretty deep on that, like really why I'm doing this. And that's my why. And you just have to persevere through it. Understand that your first episode is it's not going to be your best work, and that's okay. It's part of the growth. So just celebrate the growth, celebrate the transformation, and don't, if you're introverted, I am too, and I'm doing it, and it's become a very successful thing for what I've been able to bring into my life. It's completely changed my life in so many ways, and I just encourage anybody who's in that place to reach out if you've got any questions or you feel like that's resistance. Like, I'm here for you. I'm in your corner, so just reach out to me, and I'm here to serve and help you in any way I can. So
I appreciate that. And hey, maybe it's not a good fit for what you're looking to do, right? It's not a good fit for everyone. And I think having that resource, being able to share this episode with everyone, I think is big. It's to your point, yeah, it's a journey, right? My first episode definitely wasn't as polished. I don't even know if I have a mic here. I think I may have used my laptop mic by accident. I don't know what I was doing, but yeah, you're nervous, but no, I think it's been great. I said, let me give it a year, and I don't see myself ever stopping. I truly enjoy it, and even if it's just to meet some new people, I truly enjoy it. So yeah, lot of great stuff. I'm sure there's people listening in with a lot more as far as questions. So connect with Jake.com. By the time this is released, I'm sure there'll be a replay. Any specific questions to Jake's point, I would definitely take Jake up on that, as far as if you feel maybe personality wise you aren't a good fit, introvert to introvert, right? With Jake, definitely take him up on that. Many people would not do that, and I do appreciate that for everyone listening in. Jake, it's been a pleasure. It's been a pleasure. We could definitely be talking about this for a long time. I'm looking forward to the webinar. I'll be on Monday night, and let's definitely catch up soon after the webinar.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on the show, and it's been a pleasure to share the message, and always appreciate the opportunity.
Awesome. Thanks again, Jake.